But as we start into the book of John, it's kind of, in some ways, anticlimactic. Because as we looked, last week was like the event of history. We looked at John 20, and for actually a couple weeks, and we saw the risen Lord. And so as we look at this, there's actually some scholars that have even tried to argue, well, John 21 doesn't seem to fit some of John's narrative. You know, there's words in John 21 that he didn't use throughout, and they've even argued that it doesn't seem to fit because it seems like this little tag on the end. But as I've studied it and looked at the arguments, I really genuinely believe John 21 was written by John, and it was there for a reason. He wanted us to know that Christ's resurrection meant something moving forward, that it doesn't end there, that it has repercussions for our lives. And so we pick up in John 21 this morning in verse 1, maybe. There we go. In verse 1, it tells us, after this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. So right away, John's telling us after these things, after the resurrection, after the two appearances to the disciples, one where Thomas was not present, the other one Thomas was present, after all these things, he tells us that Jesus reveals himself again. Now there is a period of time here because now they've moved to Galilee, and so there is a chunk of window where they weren't with Christ, and they had traveled out to Galilee. But one of the things is, why are they there? Why are they in Galilee? And to understand that, we actually have to look at some of the other Gospels. And my clicker is not cooperating this morning. Can you help me one more, Kathy? There we go. One more. In Matthew 28, it tells us this, that as Jesus, after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first week, and this appearance of Mary Magdalene that we talked about in John, and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And if we move forward to verse 8, they departed quickly from the tomb. They ran with fear and great joy to tell his disciples, and behold, Jesus met them again. And so John didn't cover that part, but he says, greetings, and they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. And in verse 10, Jesus tells the women, says to them, do not be afraid, go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. And so we know that he still appeared to them in Jerusalem here shortly thereafter. We just covered that last week. So they apparently didn't listen right away, but we have to understand how this works. Where they were in Galilee and Jerusalem, it's about 75 miles. And they're traveling by foot. To give you an idea, I can tell you for a fact that Lexington, Michigan is 75 miles dead on from here. And if you know our housing situation, you know why we know that. And so it's 75 miles one way. So picture you get up from here, and he gives you some order. They probably had to get some supplies around and stuff. You couldn't walk from here to Lexington on a whim. I mean, maybe some of you could. I would have to make some preparations because that's more exercise than my body's used to. And so they would have been traveling. So there's a period of time here in between. And so we have the two appearances within the first week after the resurrection. Then these guys travel to Galilee listening to what Jesus had told them. And so this is where the story picks up in Galilee. And I might have to have your help the whole time, Kathy. I might be going dead. After this, he revealed himself to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias in Galilee, and he revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples were together. And Simon Peter says to them, I'm going fishing. Now what is Simon Peter doing? Well, we see that they have traveled 75 miles, and they're waiting for Jesus, and apparently he's not showing up in their timing. Now, have any of you ever had that? You're praying for God to move, and he doesn't show up in your timing. Never happens, right? Says the pastor who doesn't have a house. So we see they're waiting, and they're waiting, and they're waiting. Peter is notoriously impatient. And so finally he says, you know what? I can't just sit around here. This is the area he's from. I'm going fishing. That's what I know. I know how to fish. That's what Peter did. as a career before Jesus called him. And so he says, hey, I'm going fishing. And so what does buddies do? Well, if one of you has a boat and you call up me and say, hey, Pastor, I'm going fishing, I might be like, hey, I'm coming with you because I want to go out with you, right? And so they go out to join him. It's usually a two-boat operation the way they operated then. And so they say, we'll go with you. And they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Now we have to understand why they fished at night. There's a couple of main differences between commercial fishing in Jesus' day and now. The first thing is just the invention. I'm fighting a head cold, and I really don't feel well. The invention of nylon. Okay, their ropes, they didn't have nylon. So their ropes, to make them tight enough that the fish can't get out, they're a little bit heavier. So if they go out during the day, it's going to be easier for the fish to see. The other thing is that the early hours of the morning tended to be the best time to catch fish. And so these guys would go out in the late evening, and they would fish through the night. And they would actually, they would use a method where they would actually cast a net that had buoys like on the top and then like anchors on the bottom, and they would kind of go down and they would wrap it around a school of fish, and they would cast another net over them that would kind of drape down, and then they would pull it up, and that's how they would catch their fish. And so when we see later and it says that they cast their net, it literally is this net that they would have thrown out to kind of go over those fish and catch them. And so they go out and they have nothing. Now, how many here like to fish? Anybody? All right. Now, I didn't grow up fishing out on big water. You know, Ohio doesn't have all the lakes that Michigan does. My form of fishing was the farmyard pond that some people in my church had. Anybody ever fished in one of those? Some of those have some really good fish because nobody fishes them a long time. But these guys, you know, they're out, and if there's one thing that really can irritate you more than anything else, if you're out fishing and you get skunked, right? You got nothing. These guys are out all night. This is a thing that they do to earn a living, and they get skunked. It says, just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Now we know later that they were about 100 yards out. And if you've ever been to the Wilkie's Cottage, if many of you stayed there, if you've ever stayed there like on vacation this summer, we have a few times, and they have, you know, if you go out in early morning, sometimes Lake Huron will be like glass, and it'll be really calm. 100 yards out, you can see someone, you can hear somebody really well, but you can't necessarily make out a face. But sound will really, really, really travel. I know one time we were up there and there was a little guy in a rowboat out there. And I thought, you know, Lake Huron in a rowboat, that doesn't seem like a good idea. But the guy, and I could actually hear the splash of his oars because sound really travels. So Jesus is 100 yards away. There's this calm on the lake in the morning. And so they can see there's a dude out there. They can't necessarily tell who it is. And Jesus said to them, children, do you have any fish? Do you realize what Jesus is saying? Y'all got skunked, didn't you? Now, if you've ever been out fishing and you've had a frustrating night where you were this is hard work. They're casting these nets out. Many scholars say they actually, a lot of times would actually get into the water to help drag it in. You know, these guys would have been decent swimmers. And so they're probably wet, they're tired, they've been working all night, and they got some yahoo on the shore yelling at them, hey, y'all got skunked, didn't you? That's got to be irritating. And then they simply answered, no. Now, I don't know what the tone of voice of that was. I know what it would have been if it had been me. It would not have been a friendly no. But Jesus says to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. Now, this casting, so this is that net they would have thrown over top the school. That works when they have the other net in place. Otherwise, I know we have a lot of guys like to target shoot. Picture you're blindfolded, you're shooting over your shoulder, and you're trying to hit the target. I mean, just throwing a net out there willy-nilly, the chances of actually getting something are so small. But for some reason, they listen. So they cast it. I wonder what the conversation was. Who is this idiot out there? What does he think, you know? you think he sees like a school of fish? I don't know. Did we try it? Well, worst case scenario, we got to clean the nets again or whatever. So they eventually, they throw it out, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. Now, Jesus, as he starts to play this, we will start to see that this is a recounting of a previous encounter. Now, that disciple whom Jesus loved, we know that's John, therefore says to Peter, "It's the Lord." He got it, right? And isn't that how it works? That sometimes experiences can be triggers for memory for us. Or smells, too. We're going to talk about that shortly. I was down in Ohio yesterday visiting family, and a couple things triggered memories. First of all, I got out at my in-laws, and the neighbor farmer was spreading liquid manure. And so immediately I got out and go, yep, fresh country air. And it triggered memories, though. Immediately I'm thinking about growing up with cattle, and then I'm thinking about how nice it is to have fresh steak in the freezer. Guys, you know what I'm talking about? And anytime I want to have a big old T-bone. But it was bringing back memories. And so there's something about this event that immediately triggers John's memory, and he says, hey, it's the Lord. It's got to be him. And so we see when Simon Peter heard that it was Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. Now, there has been no little debate over what this means. Some scholars would argue that because Peter would have been in and out of the water, he would have been wearing as little as a loincloth to get in and out, and so he didn't get his clothes wet. And so some of the translations actually say, for he was naked. I'm not sure if that's the translation. It also could literally mean that just he took his clothes and he kind of tied them up so that they wouldn't be a mess when he got up onto the shore. It could be out of a respect for Jesus that he didn't want to show up on shore half naked. Because otherwise, when you get in the water, do you put more clothes on? No. You usually want to take stuff off, right? Take your phone out, take your wallet out, get everything off of you before you get in. But here we see Peter, he's doing something. He may have just girded up his clothes. One scholar actually argued, the last time that he had this sort of catch of fish, Jesus asked him to come follow him and leave everything, and maybe he thought, well, I better bring my clothes, because if not, they're going to be on the boat, and I'm going to be walking around following Jesus half naked. Whatever the case, Peter is impulsive, and I love this about him. He jumps in the water. It says he threw himself into the sea. I feel like this is like this scrambled, like he can't get out of that boat fast enough. And into the water, and he leaves the other guys dragging the net full of fish. And the other disciples came in the boat dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards off. And so that's where we see their distance. Kathy? And so this is kind of a reminder of a previous encounter. We have to look outside of the Gospel of John. But I think what Jesus was doing was triggering these memories. And so, Eric, if you could unmute Mark, and Mark, if you could just read this passage.
One day as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, with the people crowding around him and listening to the word of God, he saw at the water's edge 2 boats, left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you said so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners into the other boats to come and help them. And they came and filled other boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the son of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will catch men." So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him.
Thank you, Mark. I want you to notice how Peter is changed. In this, his first encounter with Jesus, we see Peter as he takes in the miracle, falling down at Jesus' feet and saying, "Get away from me. You're holy. I'm not. I can't be in your presence." Now we see, 3 years later, of walking with his beloved Lord. And when the same instance happens, he no longer says, "Get away." His reaction is, "I can't get to Jesus fast enough." I hope and pray that when God works in your life, or when he does things, or brings even hardships in your life, I hope and pray that's your attitude. I cannot get back to Jesus fast enough. So Peter, he jumps in. He's so impulsive, he's all in. And so we see the beginnings of a changed man because he's walked with the Savior. When they got out on land, it tells us they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread. And Jesus says to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." Now there's quite a few things to note from that verse. First of all, do you catch the intimacy of Christ? These guys have been out all night. He just works a miracle. And he wants to sit down and he wants to have a beach breakfast. Anybody ever done that? Beach breakfast? Nobody? Okay. The other thing, it says that there was already fish laid out on it and bread. Yet he tells them, "Bring some of yours." There's a truth that I've really learned about our God. He already has everything in place. He doesn't really need our help, but he still invites us in. Think about it. He's already cooking fish. He is the one that just worked the miracle. They work all night and they're skunked. He says, "Hey, throw it on the other side." Now they have a catch like none other. And Jesus, even though he's the one that just worked the miracle, invites them into the story and says, "Hey, why don't you bring some of your fish?" He wants us to participate with him in this intimate setting. And so Jesus says to them, "Bring some of the fish." And so Simon Peter went aboard. So he finally gets, maybe I should go help the guys. And they hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. Now, again, there has been no small debate about the symbolic meaning of 153. And I probably read 30 theories this week. Most of them are rather ludicrous. Talking about, well, if you divide it by this number and then multiply it by this, it represents this. And I just scratched my head. And I think when we read scripture like this, unless there's something really obvious, like if we see like a 7, the number of completion or something, that's one thing. But 153, I think we just take the plain meaning. It's 153 fish. Because if you're going fishing, and you've had a good success, what do? You count the fish, don't you? How many we got? Man, that's a lot. We ought to count these things. Or you measure the length and weight, right? That way when you get to church and you're telling your buddies about your fishing trip, you can elongate how big it was. So that 12-inch fish now is about 22 inches by the time you get to church the next morning, right? Or if you wait a week later, it was probably like 35 inches. It was a monster, nearly broke the line. But that's what you do. You count the fish. So I don't see any of the meanings that are argued. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. I think that's why John records it. In their culture in the time, they would have got 153 large fish. That net should have been torn. And again, I think this gives us a picture of how our God works. There will be times in our lives where he will so overwhelm us with blessing we should not even be able to contain it, and he will enlarge how much we can contain. I said we had I had a low last week. But in the midst of all this, I could tell you story after story after story of God's blessing and provision, and I never dreamt I could have held this much in. What God is doing. Many times through y'all. And so we see that. So Jesus says to them, "Come and have some breakfast." Now, none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" And so we've seen in the resurrection appearances, there's something about Jesus that is transformed. He does not necessarily look like himself totally. I don't know what that looks like. I think it gives us a picture that when we become believers, resurrected life should look so radically different from the world that people should be like, "Are you the same person?" But we see this, and it says, none of the disciples dared ask him who you are, for they knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. And again, I think Jesus is bringing up those memories. And at this point, he's probably resurrecting that memory of when he fed the 5,000 and he broke the bread. He's walking them through these experiences, and they know it's him. I wonder sometimes what the conversation was like. I almost feel like they probably just sat there and chewed. You know, like looking at each other like, "I know it's Jesus. What's he up to?" This was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Now I want to back up a little bit. The verse that said a charcoal fire. Many of you read Reverend Chaka's book when we did the prayer series. He talks about this charcoal fire. The Greek word for that charcoal fire is used all of 2 times in the New Testament. It was used earlier in John to describe the fire that Peter was standing by when he denied Christ 3 times. And now it is used here in describing the fire that Jesus was cooking on. And as we start to move forward, I think what we're going to see is we're going to start to see that Jesus is beginning to evoke some memories with Peter and walk him back through. We know in just a few verses he's going to have the restoration of Peter. And I think to do that, he walked him back through that. And do you imagine? I mean, it's, like I said, smells invoke memory, right? The other thing I had in Ohio yesterday as I was coming back, after I waited for the cows to get off the road on the one road, yeah, that's how far out in the boonies we lived, and I had to wait for them to clear. There was a farmer taking off corn, and I got a whiff of that, just that dust and stuff that comes. Man, immediately I had memories of sitting in the combine at home. I enjoyed those times in the field. We had a 1963 International Harvester. It was an old beast. She groaned and moaned, but she did the job. And immediately those memories come flooding back, and smells can really trigger memory. And so for Peter, this charcoal fire, this is the kind of stuff they would have cooked around. And so for him, probably day after day, 3 times a day, he would have smelt that fire and be reminded of his failure as a disciple. And if there's one thing that Satan seems really good at, he will take something you failed at and he will rub it in your face again and again and again. Make sure you know that you failed. And so this would have been this searing memory that Peter had. And then Jesus exposes it to him again because he's going to rewrite that memory. That smell is going to mean something new to him. And I have to say thank you, Ruth Springer. She sends me little quotes once in a while, and they're great. And so this was from Ruth. Putting Away Childish Things by David Seaman says this. This is the best biblical example of this is the way Jesus handled Peter's denial and restoration. These are the only 2 places in the New Testament where the word for charcoal fire is used. Surely this is more than coincidence. It is obvious that Jesus deliberately set the stage for his conversation with Peter on the beach that post-resurrection morning. Peter had denied him 3 times while standing near a charcoal fire in the high priest's courtyard. Now he'd be asked to reaffirm his love and loyalty 3 times. Everyone knows this part, but the fact that Jesus staged the conversation by asking Peter to relive the very setting of his denial seems to be overlooked. Surely the memory of those courtyard coals had been burning like fire in the conscious and memory of Peter. And here the master psychiatrist led Peter to face his most traumatic memory and used the charcoal fire to cauterize and heal Peter's pain and shame. And with the sting removed, Peter would be able to use that burning memory not as a curse, which crippled, but as a spark to ignite him to an even deeper devotion, even unto death. One of the things I'm really excited as we bring in Reverend Porter for our Deeper Life Conference is this is a man who met Jesus in a prison cell while doing time for drugs, and God has called him back to minister to drugs people struggling with drugs and alcohol. So instead of it being a painful memory that he's trying to run away from, God has called him back into it, and now it is a fire that lights him. And I think you'll be amazed at his just passion as he reaches these people. And so this is what we see with Peter. Jesus is molding this, taking this traumatic memory, and instead of it being something that paralyzes him now when he sees a charcoal fire, he's setting the stage that when he smells that charcoal fire, he's alive because he knows he's restored. So in verse 25, I want to go back in John 18 and look at that a little bit. If we look at Peter's denial, it tells us that now Simon Peter was standing back in John 18 and warming himself. So they said to him, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I'm not." And one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" And Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. And so we see this in John 18, this charcoal fire that Jesus is asking him to relive. Go ahead, Kathy. In Mark 14, we actually see that his denial was pretty emphatic. Mark tells us that he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know this man of whom you speak." And immediately the rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. It seems like this denial was something that was just emphatic, like he was saying, he was swearing, "I do not know the man." And Jesus had told him ahead of time that he would do this, and he had said, "No, I would never." And so in Luke 22, Jesus had told him, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers." Now Jesus tells him up front, "You're going to deny me." Now this should serve as a warning. If God has called you to serve him, if he has called you to move for his kingdom, the enemy is demanding you. But we have an intercessor before God always. The book of Hebrews tells us that. Peter said to him, "Lord, I am ready to go with you to both to prison and to death." Peter was saying, "I am ready." And then Jesus had told him, "I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day till you deny 3 times that you know me." And so we see Peter was like, "I am ready. I will follow you wherever. If it means my life, I will follow you." And then a few hours later, we see Peter denying, calling down curses, saying, "I do not know the man." And so this painful memory is seared into his heart and his mind. Now when they finished breakfast, Jesus said to Peter, now he starts to talk to him. Now we look a few verses ahead. We see at one point Peter looks behind him to see John tagging along. And so it appears that this conversation was not necessarily around the fire in front of everybody. I almost picture Jesus' just gentle call as he walked over to Peter and said, "Hey, Sarah, let's go for a walk." And that's usually when I scold her for all the bad things she does, right? No. But he would have walked over and gently said, "Hey, Pete, let's go for a walk. Let's go for a walk on the beach and talk." And here he says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Now, the more than these, scholars have debated, was it more than, do you love me more than your brothers here? Do you love me more than the fishing stuff? We don't know. But he simply asks him, "Do you love me?" And he says to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." Now, right away, we should see that our love and devotion to Christ calls forth action. We cannot declare our love and affection for Jesus Christ and sit on our hands in the pews and never move. He has called us to action. And here he says to Peter, "Feed my sheep." Back up a little bit. You skipped on me. He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, tend my sheep. And then we see the third time. And I have to imagine by now Peter, as he's relived this memory, and as Jesus starts to speak, I wonder if in his mind, if he thought, oh, Lord, don't do it a third time. Simon, son of John, do you love me? It says Peter was grieved. Some of your versions say he was hurt. Now that brings up an interesting point. Someone having hurt feelings is not necessarily a sign of sin. Jesus was sinless, and here we see him purposely hurt Simon. He needed to restore him. Peter's grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? Do you imagine the sting of that? He's running through his mind those 3 betrayals. He's like, oh, he doesn't believe me. And he shouldn't. I failed. And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. And in just a quick turnaround, Jesus takes that fire and now makes it a time of restoration. That for every time he had denied, he calls out his love again. Now he goes on to tell Peter some prophecy. He tells him, truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself, you walked wherever you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. And then John tells us this, he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. Church history tells us that Peter was crucified. Church history also tells us that he demanded to be crucified upside down because he didn't want to dishonor his Lord by being crucified the same way. And so Jesus tells him, listen, you say you love me. I'm telling you this path leads to death. You're going to follow my steps. And he says, after saying this, he said, follow me. The church has done a great disservice, especially in this country. We sell sometimes a Christianity that's about making you feel good. It's about filling that God-sized hole in your heart. Jesus sells Peter a Christianity far from that. He says, listen, this will lead to crucifixion. Follow me. Now Peter turns around and he sees the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. And I love this. You know, John, the way he describes himself, oh, he's the disciple. He's defined by Jesus' love. I imagine he sees Jesus and Peter go traipsing off on a walk and he says, you know what, you're not going without me. I'm tagging along. And Peter's response is a lot like something I would expect from my kids. He turns around, he sees John walking back there, and then John tells us the one who also had leaned back against him during the supper and said, Lord, who is it going to betray you? Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? You get it? He's saying, Jesus is just telling, listen, your path leads to death, but I still want you to follow. And Peter looks around, well, what about him? Does he get the same thing? Isn't that how we act? So often we're worried about the other person. We have God calling on each of us, saying, looking at us and saying, listen, I have a calling for you. You follow me. And the first thing we want to do, what about them? They're not doing something I like. Right? We do this as a church. I don't like the way they said that. I don't like the way they do that. I don't like the way they dress. I don't like what. Jesus, I love his response. If it's my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. I wish we could catch his voice. I think it would have been something like this. Listen, if I want him to live until I return, what is that to you? You. We're talking about you, Peter. You follow me. And for every one of us that ever had that moment where we're worried about whatever somebody else is doing, Jesus would say to me, listen, what I'm doing in their life, it doesn't matter. You follow me. And that's been a hard lesson because one of the things I've shared, as we've had multiple housing struggles, the pastors that we moved to this church and God was in it because we sold our house right away and we got a new one right away. You can tell God was in it. And it's like sandpaper, I mean, like, I don't know if that defines God being in it or not. And especially, I have a pastor friend that moved from a very ritzy area to a very poor area, and he had kind of caught the housing changes right, and he went from like little like 1,200 square foot house to like 2,800 square foot brand new house, and was like, wow, Lord. But God would say, if I want to bless him like that, that is my choice. You follow me. So whether that path is lack of housing, whether that path is you're hated in your job, whether that path means that you lose relationship with your family, Jesus calls out and says, you follow me. Now, John tells us, so the saying spread abroad among the believers that this disciple was not to die. Now, we know John went through a lot. And it seemed for a while like the dude was like indestructible. And so this rumor begins to spread that, well, maybe John's just never going to croak until Jesus comes back. But John corrects us, says, Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but he said, if it's my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? John's saying, that's not what he said. He's just saying, if I want to do that, what is that to you? It doesn't matter. And then John ends his epistle, or his gospel, in this way. He says, this is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things, and who has written these things that we may know that his testimony is true. And John wants us to end this way. He actually switches to the first person from third person for the first time, and he says, there are many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. John is saying, listen, I have seen so much that all the world could not contain what he has done in my heart. Couldn't be contained. And so John ends his gospel. But I would remind you, it tells us that he wrote these things so that we may believe. And so this morning, as we look at Peter, I think the strongest thing we must take away from this is just like Peter, God is saying to you, whatever path I have laid out in front of you, you follow me. And when we focus on him, it just works.